So I said earlier that Europeans probably would not have fought this war if they would have known that so many people would have died, right? They knew that so many people would have died, that it would have been such a long war. They probably would have reached a compromise beforehand, but they didn't know that. What was it that made this war then different from what Europeans had experienced over the last 100 years? Well, a large part of this is the development of what I would call industrial weapons, right? Industrial weapons. So, for example, you had in this time period rifles that could hit someone as far as you could see them, right? So if you could see someone, you would be able to shoot them. And these rifles were very powerful, so if you hit them, you were going to likely do a large amount of damage. You also had machine guns, more advanced than what they were using in Europeans were using in Africa. Some people still use Maxims, but you have a development in machine guns that they become even better. And to give you an idea of just how skilled and how amazing these things were, there were actual machine gunners who could figure out how to drop bullets into trenches, right? So they were such good shots, and they were able to figure out, we sometimes think of a bullet as going straight, but if you fire with a slight elevation, it will go up and then go down. And they were actually able to shoot into the opposing enemy's trenches, which is just, to me, is crazy. So these are very powerful weapons. And of course, you have amazingly powerful artillery that can fire shells from, at times, even over a mile away. And the vast majority of soldiers who were actually injured or killed were injured or killed by artillery like what you see on the right. And these were very much more powerful than, say, cannons. So you have these new industrial weapons that are incredibly powerful. And here's kind of the fundamental problem. This is an image of British soldiers going over the top, right? These are people trying to launch an offensive, right? So they're going over the top and advancing into the enemy lines. Now, you'll notice several things about this picture. First of all, there is barbed wire, right? Barbed wire is very difficult to deal with. If you've ever tried to touch or get around or climb over a barbed wire fence, it's very easy to get caught on, right? It's very easy to get your clothing or even some of your skin caught on it, and it's of course very painful. And that makes it very slow going to actually march. And they would often have lots and lots of barbed wire in front of their trenches, so that if you tried to attack them, you would have to go over this barbed wire and would be slowed down, and people would be shooting at you the whole time. So imagine, if you, like I said, trying to climb over a barbed wire fence is hard enough. Imagine trying to do that while people are shooting at you with highly accurate rifles. And you'll also notice something about this picture is that the ground is very flat. So imagine this. You are one of these British soldiers. You're ordered out of your trench to attack. While you're attacking, people are going to be shooting you with rifles, and they can see you because the rifles are so advanced, and that means they can hit you because you're trying to advance across flat ground. The artillery will be dropping shells on you. The chances of you getting, and then once you get close to the other side, you're going to have to deal with barbed wire. So the chances of many of you actually being able to cross over from your trench to the other trench is very, very low. So this creates a fundamental problem, right? I just described that from the individual perspective, right? You don't want to do that, right? You don't want to be crossing over an open field with people shooting at you when they can clearly see you and dropping artillery shells on you and so forth. That describes the situation from the perspective of an individual soldier. However, if you're a commander, this creates another problem. Traditionally, you win wars by defeating the enemy's army or seizing their capital or something like that. In other words, you win wars by going on the offensive. You don't typically win a war by just sitting and letting the enemy attack you. You have to attack the enemy. But the problem here is the invention of these new weapons, this industrial war where you have machine guns and rifles and artillery shells. It's very hard to actually win on the offensive. So we have a situation where the major advantage in a battle goes to the defense, not to the offense, right? Goes to the offense, not to the offense. But you don't win wars on the defense. You don't win wars on the defense. So that's one reason why this war is going to last so long and kill so many people, because you have to win a war typically by going on the offense, but you don't win. But here the defense has the advantage. So people are going to be constantly attacking each other, losing huge numbers of soldiers, but they still won't win, so the war will just continue. So you may recall that I said that the problem that this war going on for so long and killing so many people was not because people were dumb. In a sense, it's because they were too smart. So let me give you an example. One thing that they tried to do to break the stalemate, to allow the offenses to actually work, was to deploy poison gas. I think the Germans were the first to do this, but both sides ended up using poison gas. And poison gas at first seemed to be very effective, right? Even if it didn't kill your enemy, it could cause serious problems. For example, this is a large group of British soldiers who have been blinded by poison gas. Right, this was a group of soldiers that were blinded by poison gas, and it was hoped that gas would be able to end the war quickly. Right, you could use this as an offensive weapon and quickly end the war. The problem is that, again, these people were too smart. They developed gas masks. They even developed gas masks for horses. That's what those horses have on. Right, so the problem was that they weren't too dumb, they were too smart. Someone would come up with an invention that was designed to help end the war, to break the stalemate, to give the offense the advantage. But someone else would just come up with a countermeasure. So in this case, someone starts using poison gas. Okay, we'll just use gas masks. So now instead of having a weapon that would help end the war quickly, and I'm not defending poison gas. I don't think we should use it in battle, certainly. But at least if they would have used it and it would have ended the war, at least that would be something. At least some people would not have died. But the problem is what happened was poison gas, instead of ending the war, they developed a counter for it, but people still kept using poison gas as a weapon, so it just made people's lives more uncomfortable without actually doing anything effective. Right? No one side has a technological advantage. No one side is going to produce better generals necessarily than the other. So a new invention like poison gas, which is designed to hopefully end the war quickly, rather than ending the war quickly because the people are too smart and come up with a counter for it, all it does is just make the war more miserable, with no actual good significance. Nothing good comes out of this. It just makes people's lives more difficult because they have to spend hours and hours and hours wearing gas masks, or if they're unlucky, they just die from the gas, but not enough people die to actually make a serious, significant contribution to ending the war. To give you one more example of what I mean about, in a sense, being not too dumb, but being too smart, and that's the reason the war would go on, is the development of tanks. World War I is where we're going to first see the use of tanks in battle. They're not particularly fast in this time period, but they don't need to be. And theoretically, these monsters, and that's what the Germans called them when they first saw the British tanks, monsters, could travel across these open fields that we've been talking about earlier. Bullets would bounce off of their thick armor. They could just roll over barbed wire. And when these were first deployed, they proved to be extraordinarily effective, right? And when you think about a tank, is just a marvel of modern engineering, right? Because you've got this thing that has engines that are so powerful that it can still move despite having thick armor that can stop bullets. And of course, it itself will often have machine guns and cannons mounted on it as well. And these things initially proved very, very effective. However, despite the fact that these tanks are so awesome and such marvels of engineering, the Germans will quickly figure out a way to counter them. And you can see that here. This is basically a armored pickup truck that the Germans just threw an artillery cannon on the back. This is actually an anti-aircraft gun used to try and fire at planes. And they'll just put that on the back and just drive around and shoot the tanks. And this thing is much faster and more maneuverable than the tanks, so it's often able to hit and destroy multiple tanks relatively quickly before the tanks can do anything to counter it. So once again, we're faced with this situation where it's not that Europeans are dumb, it's that they're too smart. When one group of Europeans will figure out a way to hopefully end the war by maybe giving the advantage to the offense, which is what tanks would have done, another group of Europeans will figure out a way to counter that advantage. So remember, this war is going to continue for so long because the new industrial weapons like machine guns, powerful rifles, and artillery will give the advantage to the defense. But you generally can't win a war on the defense. You have to go on the offensive sometime. And anytime they come up with an invention that will hopefully give the advantage to the offense, the other side is able to counter it. So this is going to be a very long war. And I want to give you just one example of a World War I battle, just to give you a sense of what this means by a long war. And I'm going to give you the example of the Somme. It's a battle that focuses on the British fighting the Germans. And it's considered just a very important battle, especially in how the war is remembered, especially among the British. So notice the Somme will begin on July 1st, 1916. On that first day, the British Army will suffer its worst day in military history up till then and up till now. It will suffer over 50,000 casualties. If you're not familiar with the term casualty includes killed, wounded, and missing. Missing often means people who have been killed in such a way that you cannot find the bodies. They were hit by an artillery shell and basically blown to bits. So over 50,000 people, British people in one day. That's about, the city of Greenwood has about 30,000 people in it. So that's a lot of people in one day to have killed, missing, or wounded. This battle will last months. It lasts until November of 1916. So, for example, if you think about the American Civil War, most battles last a day, 2 days. Gettysburg lasted 3 days. This is an active battle that will last for months. And in the end, if you total all the sides who fought in the battle, which would be the British, the Germans, and then I believe the French also tried to help the British. And I should point out British, that I mean the empire, so that would include people from India, from Canada, and from New Zealand. You're going to have over 1 million casualties. More than 150,000 of those will be dead. Right, so that's just a tremendous loss of life. Right, 1 million dead, wounded, or missing coming out of this battle that doesn't last days, it lasts months. And again, that's horrifying. But what makes this even worse is this isn't like a turning point. This isn't a moment when we can say, aha, this is where, because Britain won this battle, the war is going to end soon. No, the war is going to go on for a couple more years after this. So you have all these people die, all these people wounded, and it doesn't really accomplish much. If I recall correctly, this is considered technically a British victory because they advanced 6 miles. So they fought for months, and then all these people die, all these people are wounded, and the change is 6 miles advance into enemy territory. And it doesn't significantly lead to the end of the war. So we can see this is going to be a long war. The defense is heavily favored. Any kind of movement, any kind of advance is going to cost the lives of huge numbers of people. And this leads to the concept of total war. This is going to be a war between industrialized nation states. It is a war that will require not only advanced weaponry, but huge amounts of it. It's not enough just to have cannon. You have to have literally millions of cannon shells to fire. You have to have hundreds of millions of bullets to fire. And because no one side has a major technological advantage and no side can win a decisive victory, this is going to be a war of attrition, right? So this is the key thing. If it's a short war, a lot of times it goes to whoever has the best generals. It goes to whoever has a technological advantage. But in this case, the weapons that they are using against each other, the Europeans are using, are effectively equal, right? The weapons they're using are effectively equal. So there's no brilliant general, there's no technological advantage that will allow anyone to win a decisive victory. So what we're going to have is what's called a war of attrition. All wars are pretty bad, but you certainly do not want to be in a war of attrition, because a war of attrition is basically an endurance test. Whoever can last the longest wins, right? Whoever can last the longest wins. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Whoever gets tired first and gives up, they lose. Whichever side is able to keep fighting, whichever side has the resources, both material and human, is going to win. So if you lose 100,000 soldiers, but you can put another 100,000 in the field, well and good, you may win. So again, this is just a terrible war, because whoever's going to win it is the one that can sustain losses the best. And because of this, you have to mobilize all of society. Civilians, in particular, will be mobilized, for example, to produce weapons. Traditionally, and we talked about this, that there was women's labor in the industrial period, the Industrial Revolution. Women always had a history of working, but they're going to work even more and in more dangerous positions. Traditionally, women had worked mostly making cloth and textiles and things like that. But increasingly, women, and these are pictures of British women, will be mobilized to produce weapons. This is very dangerous work. A lot of British women will be wounded or killed from accidents from making explosives, because, of course, they're dangerous. Sometimes they blow up before they're intended to. And this is one reason why British women will, at least some women, property women will get the right to vote as recognition of the suffering, of the sacrifice that women also made during this war. But the key thing is, because this is a total war in which every single person is extraordinarily important for the war effort, in order to maximize the number of soldiers you have at the front, you're going to be mobilizing women to work in factories. So this isn't a war simply between two armies. This is a war of a society versus another society, right? It's a total war in which everyone is mobilized to fight. Don't think of World War I as a war simply between armies. It is a war between societies, right? In which every single person has to be mobilized in order to help win the war. And the people in this time realize this. For example, this is a British poster, and it says, the man behind the gun. And this is likely would have been hung up in a factory to remind the workers that their labor is enabling the soldiers to continue fighting, and to make sure, in a sense, to inspire them to do their best for the fighting men, to do their best for those soldiers, make artillery shells, make them well, make a lot of them so that your guys, your fellow Britons will be able to fight and win, right? So there's this recognition that there's a connection, that civilians, the work they're doing is directly significant for the war effort. And here's a couple of American posters that I think show this very effectively. The one on the left says, "Wake up, America." America is presented again as Columbia, this woman. Civilization calls every man, woman, and child. Right, so we're fighting this war, but it's not just men. Women and children also have their role to play in helping to win the war. And on the right, you can see how strong this is. This isn't just rhetoric. This actually has to do directly with practical contributions. So if you look on the right, it says, "Boys and girls, you can help your Uncle Sam win the war. Save your quarters, buy war saving stamps." So the idea of what would happen is these are kind of like simple bonds. You buy the stamps using your money, and then the government agrees that later on you can return the stamps and you will be given your money plus some interest back. So you may buy the stamps for $0.25, and the government promises that in a couple of years you can return them for 30 cents. So these are basically war bonds. And the idea is they're selling this to boys and girls, to kids, because there's this idea that any extra bit of money that you are able to use, that's maybe one more tank, that's one more airplane, that's one more machine gun, and that might be the one that turns the tide. Because remember, this is a war of attrition. Whichever society is able to put more soldiers in the field and keep them there and keep them supplied is the society that's going to win this war. And people took this very seriously and are trying to harness the power of civilians. And so here's the problem. If civilians are directly related to the war effort, if civilians make a real contribution on a wide scale to the war effort, in a sense that makes them targets, right? As long as it's clear, there's a clear distinction between civilians and soldiers, and it's understood that this is a war between soldiers, you don't make war on civilians. But with a growing understanding that this will be a total war based on resources, and whichever side is able to survive the longest, war on civilians starts to make sense. So to give an example, Germany will face a blockade. The British will blockade Germany, so Germany cannot import food from overseas. And Germany has trouble growing food, of course, because it has large numbers of men not in the fields working, but in uniform fighting. So food shortages in Germany will kill about 800,000 German civilians. And what's really striking is during the negotiations to end the war, the blockade would actually continue, and as a kind of way of pressuring Germany, and so more civilians would die. And this again is striking because people are taking actions that they know will kill civilians in order to accomplish their military and diplomatic goals. Germany is not going to just accept that, so Germany will actually use submarine warfare in an attempt to do the same thing to Britain. So Germany will start using submarines to attack British shipping. At first, the Germans do not target passenger ships, and because this is a total war and the British want to make sure they can get all the resources that they can, they will start putting war supplies on passenger ships. And so the Germans will start sinking passenger ships. So you can see how this kind of escalates, right? There's this idea that we need to follow some rules, but then people will kind of use those rules and find loopholes, which will lead to an escalation of violence. And so the Germans are sinking passenger ships, and the United States actually will almost go to war with Germany in 1916 because German submarines will sink the passenger ship Lusitania, and with a large number of American citizens on board. And Americans are very upset about this. And you can see this on the left. There is a picture of basically this is from a newspaper explaining the schedule of the Lusitania, the ship. And at the bottom it says, notice, this is a message added by the Imperial German Embassy saying, we will sink this ship. You travel at your own risk. So we see here now civilians are going to become casualties. And it's important to note, we often talk about the 9 to 10 million. I've heard different numbers quoted. I mean, once you get in the millions, I'm not sure if it matters exactly. Military deaths, I believe another 5 or 6 million civilians died in World War I. And it's because of things like this. One thing that's also astounding and I think fascinating about World War I is this is the first war where aviation will be important. Right, so we're actually going to have people flying around in airplanes, and initially airplanes will be used for scouting. You can fly over the enemy's trenches and get an idea of where their forces are, where their artillery is, and so forth. And eventually you'll develop fighter planes to try and shoot down the opponent's scouts so they can't scout. And of course, eventually people will figure out how to make things like bombers. Right, so we'll have this new kind of aeronautical advances in World War I. And this will help lead to, again, war on civilians. Right. For example, Germans will use some planes, but they will also use Zeppelins, dirigibles, which are basically like giant blimps, to bomb military targets in England. Right. They will start doing this. Now, the thing is, dropping a few bombs on a military base really isn't going to do much damage. So what the Germans start doing is bombing factories that are producing military supplies. Right. And this was actually a fairly effective tactic in some ways because they would bomb a factory and then the workers would be too afraid to show up the next day. But they would start bombing factories producing military supplies, which of course could kill civilians. Right. If you bomb a factory, there is a good chance that there is someone working in the factory, especially during a wartime situation. So you can see how this escalates. Okay, we're going to bomb military targets. Oh, that's not very effective. So let's start bombing factories that produce military supplies because, hey, they're supplying the military. And eventually the Germans just say, the civilians are supporting the military, so let's just bomb the city. Let's just bomb whatever and kill some people. And so Germany will, for example, bomb London. And now in this time period, this is actually does not kill many people. I believe the German bombing of civilians in London killed about 400 people. And again, I don't want to be callous because, of course, to those 400 people and their families and friends, that's terrible. But in terms of the significance of the damage on a grand scale, it was not that significant. And so the limits of technology in this time period prevent large numbers of civilians from dying. However, the principle has kind of been established that we can bomb civilians in a total war, and that will continue. Right, later on into World War II, when there aren't those limits of technology, when they'll be able to build much more effective bombers. Thus far, we've been focusing on the war in Europe, but this is called World War I, and it's called that for a reason because it did involve a good portion of the world, though not in the to the degree that it did in World War II. Right, most of the fighting will still take place in Europe here. Though there will also, if you look at this map in Africa, there's actually quite a bit of fighting in Africa as well. But the bulk of the war actually occurs in Europe. We refer to it, though, as a world war, and I would say a global war, because a lot of people other than Europeans will be involved, right? And you can get that sense from this map, right? There's lots of people from lots of different places becoming involved in this war. One thing that I thought that was a problem with this map, you may notice there's some extra purple arrows. Those are arrows I added, because it doesn't recognize, for example, that several 100,000 Chinese actually went to France to help dig trenches for the Allies. China will be on the side of the Allies. It also doesn't note that Japan was active in this war. Japan will seize German territory in China and German territory in the Pacific Ocean, various islands that had become German colonies. And one thing that maybe will surprise you, because, of course, we think about Japan in World War II being on the side of Germany, but in World War I, Japan was on the side of the capitalist liberal democracies. It was on the side of Great Britain. And later on, when the United States joins the war, on the American side as well. So it's important for us to kind of understand how this was a global war that involved lots of different people from lots of different places. And just to kind of go a little bit more deeper, to give you some examples, like I said, the Japanese will, and this is very important as we get in, especially to the next section, so do pay careful attention to this, please. The Japanese will seize territory in Qingdao, which is a region in China. This had originally been Chinese territory, but the Chinese, under German pressure, had leased it to the Germans and given the Germans special rights there. The Japanese will come in because they're an ally of Britain. They will become involved in the Great War, World War I, on the side of the Allies. They'll come in then and attack with the British these German possessions. So the Japanese will be actively intervening in this war. They won't do a whole lot in Europe, but they will do some. But their major contribution, in a sense, is attacking German possessions in China and in the Pacific Ocean. But do keep this in mind, that this is very complex, because you have Japanese who are on the side of the Allies taking territory that's controlled by the Germans but that belongs to China, which is also an ally. And while the Chinese are not going to send fighting forces, they will send several 100,000 laborers, and you can see them being supervised by a British officer who will help carry out the hard labor that is needed in order to support the war effort, such as digging trenches. And even though they will not be directly fighting, they will still have losses from disease. Of course, sometimes even if you're a civilian, you can still get killed in a war. Bullets don't differentiate. And of course, some will, like I said, will die of disease. But I want to stress again, these are Chinese who are helping on the side of the Allies and the British side. And of course, we want to emphasize that for whenever you have someone digging a trench, then that frees up someone else to fight. So by having these Chinese laborers do this hard work, that means that British soldiers are able not to do it, and they can concentrate on fighting the war. So this is a real contribution, even though these aren't combat troops that China is sending. And of course, people will mobilize their empires, right? So for example, these are Sikhs, these are Indian troops who are fighting on the side of the British in Europe, right? So this is one reason we call this a world war, a global war, because these troops, when I talk about British troops doing this or that, don't just think like white European soldiers. This would also, of course, include white people from Canada or from Australia, but of course it would also include non-white people, Asian Indians in this case, from India, who are also going to fight in the trenches. The Africans would also be involved in this war. These, just like the British would mobilize their empire in India, they would also do the same thing in Africa, and the French would also mobilize soldiers from Africa. And so these are African soldiers, but you can clearly see they are wearing French uniforms, right? So again, this is a total war in which you need large numbers of people to be able to fight and to win. So you're going to mobilize every person in your empire that you possibly can. So Africans will be brought in, enlisted in the army, brought into Europe to help fight for either the British or the French empires.